Hi, my name's Nicole Sherman, and I'm going to speak today about anxiety, arousal, and peak performance in sport. So, when we're speaking about anxiety, we're usually speaking about a negative emotional state that is categorized by nervousness, worry, and apprehension, and is associated with the arousal of the body. When we speak of arousal, we're speaking of the psychological and physiological activation or awakeness of the body. So, from a sleeping body to a body that's at peak performance is the arousal sort of continuum. When we speak about anxiety, there's a couple of different types. So, there's trait anxiety, which is basically your baseline anxiety. So, your anxiety that you have as a personality. So, some people have higher anxiety than others, and some people are very sort of low based anxiety, obviously determined on situational factors and that. And then the state anxiety is more of the moment to moment anxiety. So the anxiety that occurs as you get closer to a performance or event. So cognitive anxiety is the thoughts that you have. So I'm not as good as the person next to me, I'm not as fast, I'm not as strong, I'm not as whatever as the person next to me. And then there's somatic anxiety, which is the physiological changes in the body. So increased heart rate, sweating, feelings of butterflies in your stomach, increased frequency of urination, difficulties sleeping, all of those sort of physiological changes that happen to the body when you're anxious or feeling nervous or something like that. Another factor that affects our arousal and anxiety and in peak performance in sport is our perceived control. So someone who's practiced and practiced and practiced, say an athlete going to the Olympics for the last 4 years, that they've practiced and practiced and practiced leading up to the Olympics, so their perceived control is a lot higher than, say, mine is if you were to put me in the Olympics. So perceived control has effects on your confidence, your ability and your experience. So someone with high confidence, high ability and high experience is going to have a higher perceived control than someone with lower forms of that in an event. So the goal of anxiety and arousal is to have it at a point that executes your peak performance. So for some people, your anxiety will need to be lower for your peak performance, and for some people you will need higher anxiety for peak performance. And there's different theories across time that have explained that, from the drive theory that originally explained that arousal and anxiety were linear. So as your anxiety and arousal rose, so did your performance in a linear fashion. Then there's the inverted U hypothesis that explains that as your anxiety and arousal arises, so does your performance to a point, and then you become over-aroused and your performance decreases. That theory puts the optimum performance, peak performance, in the middle for everyone. So that wasn't individualized. So Hennon came along and had an individualized approach that said, athlete A, their peak performance happens at a lower point because they don't need as much arousal to get their peak performance, but athlete C needs a lot of anxiety and arousal to achieve peak performance. So that was a more individualized view. So that was individualized zones of optimal performance of Hennon. So that was much more individualized and effective for describing anxiety and arousal for people. So when we're looking at anxiety and arousal, there's guidelines that you follow that help sort of identify and achieve peak performance for an athlete. And the first one would be to identify optimum arousal and related emotions. So for that individual, where is their optimum arousal? Do they need a lot of anxiousness and nervousness and that to achieve peak performance, or do they not need as much? Do they need to be having those negative thoughts like I'm not as fast as the person next to me in order to push them to go faster and achieve peak performance? Or do they need to think that they're in control and that they've got that perceived control and the ability and all of that sort of together, and then that equals their peak performance? So it's highly determinant on the individual, and the first step would be to identify how that individual does that. The second step would be to recognise the interaction of personal and situational factors, and that would be sort of the environment. So do they perform better with lots of people around? Do they perform better alone? Do they perform better in a warm pool to a cold pool if they're swimming? All those sort of factors. So you need to recognise what they are, what ones you can control and what you can't, and how you, if you can't control it, how you can set them up for success without controlling it. So the third one would be to recognise the signs of anxiety and arousal. So as we talked about before, the somatic signs are increased heart rate, sweating, feeling sick, all of those things. And the cognitive signs would be having those negative thoughts, or like I can't do this, I'm not good enough, those sort of things. So those signs of anxiety and arousal, so recognition. Number 4 would be to tailor coaching strategies. So if you had an athlete that needed to achieve a lot of anxiety and arousal, you would need to tailor your coaching strategies before the event to make sure that they achieved that high level of anxiety and arousal. So the way you spoke to them, motivational, or whether you said things that would make them anxious so that they could achieve that peak performance, or whether you said things that would calm them down so that they weren't over aroused. And then the last one would be to develop their confidence. So the more confident an athlete is, the higher their perceived control is, and then the more control they have over their anxiety and arousal. And all up, that would equal peak performance in an athlete, which is what you want to achieve when you're performing in a sporting event. So that's my quick sum up of anxiety, arousal, and peak performance.